What would you do if the person you spent 3 years grieving was standing 40 feet away from you, laughing, holding a child's hand, and looking absolutely unbothered while you could barely get through a Tuesday without feeling like the floor might swallow you whole? Welcome back to Dad's Real Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it. Here, let me set the scene for you. Rome, Italy, June. The kind of afternoon where the sun hits the cobblestones just right, and even the pigeons look like they belong in a painting. I was there for a work conference. I'm a structural engineer, so yes, my idea of a vacation was inspecting Roman architecture and pretending it was fun. Don't judge me. My colleague and closest friend, I'll call him Danny, had been the one to drag me out of the hotel room that evening. I had every intention of ordering room service, watching something mindless on television, and sleeping by 9 like the emotionally exhausted man I was. But Danny, God bless his stubborn soul, knocked on my door at 8:45 with his jacket already on and that look on his face. You know the look, the one that says, "I've already decided for both of us." He said to me, "Vic, you've been to Rome twice and never once sat at a real outdoor cafe. That's actually criminal. Get your jacket." I told him, "Danny, I'm tired." He said, "You're always tired. You've been tired for 8 years. The cafe is 2 blocks away. Move." And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how I ended up sitting at a little outdoor cafe on the Vadel Croce, sipping an Aperol spritz I didn't ask for, watching tourists stumble over themselves trying to take the perfect photo, completely unaware that my entire world was about to detonate. Now, before I go further, let me tell you about my wife. Her name was Claire Michelle Caldwell. She had this laugh that could embarrass you in a quiet restaurant and make you love her for it anyway. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party in Chicago. She spilled red wine on my white shirt, looked me dead in the eye and said, "That's on you for wearing white to a party." I married her 14 months later. I know. 8 years ago, Claire went on a girls' trip, a cruise along the Mediterranean with her 2 closest friends, Sandra and Beth. I remember standing at the departure terminal with her luggage, pretending I wasn't going to miss her like a lost limb. She kissed me twice, told me not to eat cereal for dinner every night, and walked through those doors, rolling her little burgundy suitcase. 4 days later, I got a phone call. There was an accident on the ship, a midnight deck, a railing that gave way. 2 witnesses. They recovered her belongings, her bracelet, the one I gave her on our first anniversary. They never recovered her body. The Coast Guard said the current in that part of the Mediterranean made full recovery. Unlikely, as if the ocean owed me better grammar. I planned a funeral for a woman with no casket. I stood in front of our family and friends in a black suit that felt 3 sizes too small, and I talked about Claire like she was already past tense. Her mother, a woman named Patricia, held my hand through the entire service and wept so hard I thought she might actually break. 8 years I went to grief therapy. I sold our apartment. I threw myself into work. I learned slowly, painfully, how to be a person again. And then Danny made me leave my hotel room. So there we are. Outdoor cafe Aperol spritz. Danny is telling me some long-winded story about a woman he met at the airport. And I am half listening, half watching a street musician butcher a Frank Sinatra song when something at the edge of my vision makes me stop, not slow down. Stop. There is a woman across the street. She is standing outside a gelato shop, laughing at something the man beside her just said. She has dark brown hair, that specific shade, the one that looks almost auburn when the light hits it. She's wearing a yellow sundress. She has one hand resting on the shoulder of a little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, and beside the little girl is what appears to be an identical child, twins. My brain does what brains do. It files it under coincidence and tries to move on. But my eyes are not cooperating. I said to Danny very slowly, "Hey, don't make it obvious, but look across the street." The woman in the yellow dress. Danny turned his head with all the subtlety of a man who has never once been subtle in his life and looked directly at her. He turned back to me and said, "She's pretty. You should go talk to her. This is exactly the kind of, does she look like anyone to you?" He looked again, longer this time, and I watched the smile drain from his face like water from a bathtub. He turned back to me and said nothing, which, if you know Danny, is the single most terrifying thing he is capable of doing. I said, "Say something." He said, "Vic?" I said, "I know what I'm looking at, Danny. Say something." He sat down his glass and said very quietly, "It's probably just someone who looks like her. People have twins, not like that. I mean, doppelgangers. You know what I mean? It's a coincidence. You see, Claire had a small crescent-shaped birthmark just below her left ear, barely visible unless you knew it was there. The kind of detail you only know if you've been close enough long enough." The woman across the street tilted her head to say something to the man beside her, and there it was, right below her left ear, a small crescent-shaped mark. Now, here is where I need you to stay with me. Because what happened next is the part that changed everything. And I mean everything. Not just about Claire. Not just about the accident, but about the marriage I thought I knew, the woman I thought I loved, and a secret so buried, so deliberately hidden, that when it finally surfaced, it didn't just shock me. It rewrote every single memory I had. But before we get there, I need you to understand what I did next. Because I didn't walk across that street. I didn't call her name. I didn't cry or freeze or cause a scene in the middle of a Roman street like some unhinged man who'd seen a ghost. No. I picked up my glass. I took a long, slow sip, and I said to Danny very calmly, "I need you to take a photo right now without her seeing you." Danny looked at me like I had suggested something illegal. I looked back at him and said, "Danny, photo now." He picked up his phone, and that photo, that one blurry, slightly off-angle photo taken by a man with shaking hands, became the first thread I pulled. And oh, did everything unravel. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor, subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you, genuinely. Let me tell you something about being an engineer. We are not dramatic people by nature. We don't guess. We don't assume. We don't look at a crumbling bridge and say, "I have a feeling it'll hold." We measure. We verify. We follow the evidence until the evidence tells us something we can actually stand behind. So, when I tell you that I spent the entire night after that cafe sitting on the edge of my hotel bed, staring at a blurry photo on Danny's phone, going back and forth between "that is absolutely clear" and "you've lost your mind, Victor," I need you to understand that this was not me being dramatic. This was me doing the only thing I knew how to do, trying to find proof. Danny had barely slept either. He knocked on my door at 7 the next morning, holding 2 coffees and wearing yesterday's shirt. He handed me a cup, sat down in the chair by the window and said, "Okay, walk me through it." I said, "Walk you through what?" He said, "Whatever is happening in your head right now because you've got that face." I said, "What face?" He said, "The face you had when you figured out the Mercer building had a foundation problem 8 months before anyone else noticed." The quiet, dangerous face. That face. I almost smiled. Almost. I pulled up the photo on his phone and placed it on the table between us. We both stared at it. A woman in a yellow dress, slightly blurred, caught mid-laugh. A man beside her. 2 little girls. I said her name was Claire, and that woman has her hair, her build, her laugh. Danny. I could see her laugh from across the street, and I knew it before I heard it. And the birthmark could be coincidence. I said it was crescent-shaped below the left ear exact position. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "So, what are you saying, Vic?" that she faked her death. I said, "I'm not saying anything yet. I'm saying I need to find that woman again." Danny leaned back and rubbed his face with both hands the way he does when he knows there's no talking me out of something. He said, "Of course you do." I said, "The gelato shop. It was on Via della Croce. People return to places they like. We go back." He looked at me for a long moment and then he said, "You know what? Fine. But if this turns out to be a random Italian woman who just happens to look like Claire, you owe me an actual vacation with a beach and no architecture." I said, "Deal." We went back to that street the next morning, and the morning after that, by the third day, I felt slightly unhinged, sitting at the same cafe, ordering coffee I didn't need, watching a gelato shop like some underpaid private investigator in a movie where nobody wins. And then on the afternoon of the third day, she walked out of a building 4 doors down from the gelato shop. No twins this time. No man. Just her. A tote bag over one shoulder, sunglasses on, moving with that specific unhurried confidence that I had spent 14 months falling in love with and 3 years trying to forget. Danny saw her the same moment I did. He said, "Vic, I was already standing." He grabbed my arm and said, "Wait, what's the plan here?" I said, "I'm going to walk past her close enough to see her face properly." He said, "And if it is her?" I said, "Then I'll figure out the next part." He said, "That is genuinely the worst plan I've ever heard." But he let go of my arm. I crossed the street. And I want to be honest with you, my heart was doing something completely unprofessional in my chest. 8 years of grief, of therapy, of learning how to breathe around the absence of this woman. And now every single step I took toward her felt like walking through wet cement. I slowed my pace. She was looking down at something in her tote bag. I came within about 10 ft. She looked up and I stopped walking. It was her face. Every single feature I had memorized and tried to unmemorize. The slope of her nose, the slight arch of one eyebrow higher than the other, the mouth that always looked like it was 1 second away from saying something that would either charm you or destroy you. But here is the thing, and this is the part that cracked something open inside me. She looked at me the way you look at a stranger. Not with guilt, not with panic, not with the wide-eyed shock of a woman caught living a life she shouldn't have. She looked at me the way you look at someone who accidentally stepped into your walking path. Mild, polite, entirely unbothered, she said, and I remember every syllable. "Sorry, am I in your way?" An American accent, my stomach dropped straight through the cobblestones, I said. And I have no idea how my voice came out this steady. "No, you're fine, I'm sorry." She smiled, that smile, that exact smile, and walked past me. I stood on that street and did not move for what felt like a full minute. When I got back to Danny, he looked at my face and said, "It's her, isn't it?" I sat down. I picked up my coffee. I took a sip. Even though it had gone cold, I said, "She didn't recognize me." He said, "What?" I said, "She looked right at me, Danny." Not a flicker, not a single moment of recognition. She asked me if she was in my way. He stared at me. Then he said very carefully, "Vic, is it possible you're wrong, that it's just she has Claire's voice?" I said, "Same pitch, same cadence, same accent, same everything." The table went quiet, and then I said the thing that had been forming in the back of my mind for 3 days. The thought I had been engineering slowly the way you build a structure from the foundation up. I said, "Danny, what if Claire never told me she had a sister?" He blinked. "A sister? An identical twin?" I said, "What if Claire had a twin that nobody in her life, nobody in my life ever knew about?" Danny opened his mouth. I closed it. I opened it again. He said, "That's Vic. That's insane. How do you hide a twin sister from your husband?" I said, "The same way you hide anything. Very carefully and with a very good reason." I pulled out my phone. I opened my contacts and I scrolled until I found a name I hadn't called in 3 years. Patricia, Claire's mother. Danny saw the name and his eyes went wide. He said, "You're calling her mother right now from Italy." I said, "Vic, if you're wrong, this woman just lost her daughter." "I know what she lost," I said quietly. "I lost her too." He went silent. I pressed call. The phone rang 4 times. Then a familiar voice, tired, older than I remembered, but unmistakable, came through the line. She said, "Hello." I said, "Patricia, it's Victor." 3 full seconds of silence. And in those 3 seconds, I heard something that no grieving mother should produce at the sound of her dead daughter's husband calling out of nowhere after years of silence. I heard fear, not surprise, not relief, not the tearful warmth of a woman reconnecting with the son-in-law she once loved. Cold, unmistakable, carefully controlled fear. She said, "Victor, my goodness, this is where are you calling from?" I said, "Patricia, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." She said, "Of course, sweetheart. What is it?" I said, "Did Claire have a sister?" Silence. The kind of silence that is not empty. The kind that is absolutely full. She said, "What, Victor? What kind of question, Patricia?" Another silence, shorter this time. And then, barely above a whisper, "Who have you been talking to?" Not. No, of course not. Not. What are you talking about? Who have you been talking to? I looked at Danny across the table. His face had gone completely pale. I said, "Nobody, but I think it's time you and I had a very long conversation." She hung up. And that right there, that dial tone in my ear standing on a Roman street in the middle of June, was the exact moment I understood that Claire's death wasn't the secret. Claire's life was. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. So, thank you for real. Here is something nobody tells you about discovering a life-altering secret. It doesn't arrive like lightning. It doesn't hit you all at once in one clean, dramatic moment where everything becomes clear and the music swells and you finally understand. It arrives like water damage. Slow, quiet. And by the time you see it, the walls are already ruined. Patricia hung up on me, which, if I'm being honest, told me more than any answer she could have given. I sat with that dial tone for about 4 seconds. Then I booked a flight home. Danny looked at me across that cafe table and said, "We still have 2 days left on the conference." I said, "I know." He said, "You're leaving anyway, aren't you?" I said, "Danny, that woman hung up the moment I mentioned a sister." She didn't deny it. She didn't laugh it off. She asked me who I'd been talking to. That is not a grieving mother reacting to a strange question. That is a woman who has been waiting 8 years for a specific phone call and is terrified it finally came. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he called the airline himself to change his own ticket. I said, "You don't have to come." He said, "Victor, you once tried to eat cereal for dinner 4 nights in a row after Claire died. You are not doing this alone. Let's go pack." I don't say this enough. Danny is the best person I know. Patricia lived in Naperville, Illinois, a quiet house on a quiet street that I had visited dozens of times during my marriage and a handful of times after the funeral. The kind of house that smelled like dryer sheets and had too many decorative throw pillows. I always felt welcome there. I did not feel welcome when I knocked on that door. She opened it after a long pause, long enough that I knew she had looked through the peephole and made a decision about whether to answer. She was smaller than I remembered, grayer. She had the look of a woman who had been carrying something heavy for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. She said, "Victor." I said, "Patricia, can I come in?" She stepped back and let me inside without another word. We sat in the living room, the same living room where I had once watched football with her late husband, where Claire and I had announced our engagement, where I had sat in a fog after the funeral eating casserole I couldn't taste. Patricia folded her hands in her lap and looked at me the way people look at a verdict they've been dreading. I didn't waste time. I said I saw her in Rome. I was 10 F'd away from her. She spoke to me and didn't recognize me, which means she either has a serious medical condition or she is not Claire. The silence stretched so long I thought she might simply refuse. And then she exhaled slowly, completely like a woman setting down a bag she'd been carrying for 8 years. And she said, "Her name is Kara. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Kara, one letter different. One single letter separating two lives that apparently ran parallel to each other for decades without me ever knowing the second one existed," I said very quietly. "Claire had an identical twin named Kara." Patricia nodded. I said, "And in 14 months of dating and 4 years of marriage, she never told me." Patricia said, "She never told anyone, Victor." That was the agreement. I said, "What agreement? What does that mean?" "What agreement?" Patricia looked at her hands. She said, "When the girls were 9 years old, their father and I separated. It was not a good situation. He was not a good man. When we finally got out, there were people connected to him, dangerous people who made it very clear that if he couldn't have us, nobody would." The room felt very still. She continued, "We had to disappear. Both girls, different paths. It was the only way to guarantee both of them were safe. Claire came with me. Kara went with my sister out to the West Coast. We agreed. No contact, no connection. Because any connection between them was a thread someone could pull to find both of them." I stared at her. I said, "You separated your twin daughters to protect them." She said, "I separated my twin daughters to keep them alive. There is a difference." And here is where I had to just sit back, because every version of Claire I had ever known was quietly rearranging itself in my mind. Every time she had been vague about her childhood. Every time she'd changed the subject when family came up. Every time I'd chalked it up to grief over her father, a man she claimed had simply walked out and never returned. She hadn't been grieving an absent father. She had been protecting a secret that kept her sister breathing. I said, "The accident, the cruise." Patricia's jaw tightened. I said, "Was it real?" She looked at me then, and I saw something in her face that I was not prepared for. It was grief. Specific, unperformed, bone-deep grief. The kind you cannot manufacture. She said, "Yes, Victor, my daughter died. Claire died. I need you to understand that my chest did something complicated." I said, "Then who is in Rome?" She said, "When Claire died, when it actually happened, I made a decision. Kara didn't know Claire existed. Claire didn't know Kara existed, but I knew both of them. And I," clears throat, "had Carrara's contact through my sister." She paused. "I told Kara about Claire after the accident. For the first time, I told her she had a twin sister and that the twin sister was gone." I said, "How did she take it?" Patricia almost smiled, sad and small. She said, "How would you take it? Finding out you had a sister you never knew and that she was already dead?" I had no answer for that. She said, "Carr is a good woman, Victor. She built a life in Europe. She married a man named James. They have twin daughters of their own." She paused again. The irony of that is not lost on me. I leaned forward. I said, "Patricia, does Kara know about me?" Patricia was quiet for just a beat too long. I said, "Patricia." She said she knows Claire was married. She knows your name. She has seen photos. Something cold moved through me. I said she looked right at me in Rome and didn't react. If she's seen photos and she wasn't expecting to see the husband of the twin sister she never met standing on a street in Rome. I sat back. I pressed my fingers to my forehead, and for a long moment I just breathed, because here is what I was processing. Claire was real. Our love was real. Her death was real. There was no betrayal, no conspiracy, no deliberate deception directed at me. There was just a woman who had carried a secret so long it had become part of her skeleton. A secret born not from selfishness, but from survival. And somewhere in Rome, there was a woman who looked exactly like my wife, living a life my wife never got to finish. I said, I want to meet her. Patricia said, Victor, she is the only living piece of Claire that exists in this world. And she doesn't even know what Claire was like. She doesn't know how she laughed, or what she was afraid of, or what she ordered at restaurants, or what she said the morning before she left for that cruise. My voice cracked on that last part. I hadn't planned on that. Patricia was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I'll reach out to her. I can't promise anything, but I'll reach out. 3 weeks later, I got a message from an unknown number. It said, This is Kara. My mother told me what happened in Rome. I think I'd like to talk if you're open to it. I have a lot of questions about my sister. I imagine you might have a few too. I read that message 4 times. Then I called Danny. He picked up on the second ring and I said, She reached out. He said, Kara. I said, Yeah. He said, How do you feel? I thought about it honestly, fully, for the first time, without the weight of suspicion or shock or grief clouding everything. I said, like, I get to tell someone about Claire, someone who never got to know her, someone who deserved to. Danny was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Then call her back, Vic. I did. And that conversation lasted 4 hours, and somewhere in the middle of it, past the questions and the photographs I described and the stories she had never heard. Carla laughed, and I recognized the laugh before it even finished leaving her mouth. I did not cry about it. I'm a structural engineer from Chicago. I don't do that. But if Danny ever tells you I did, I'm not confirming anything. The woman who died twice never came back. But the part of her that was always missing, the part even she didn't know existed, was finally quietly found.